The Billionaire's Secret Heir. Written by the Sugared Pen. Narrated by Jane Parker. Chapter 1. Harper Reed tugged at the hem of her simple black dress and shifted uncomfortably in her pinching heels. The charity gala around her shimmered with chandeliers, polished marble floors, and people dressed in outfits that cost more than she made in a year. She balanced a tray of champagne flutes, weaving through the glittering crowd, careful not to bump into anyone. The room buzzed with talk about the night's biggest donor, Dominic Gray. His name floated on conversations like a legend, cold, calculating, impossibly handsome. Harper hadn't seen him yet, but her curiosity was piqued. That kind of man couldn't possibly live up to his reputation. She adjusted her grip on the tray, lost in thought, when she bumped into someone. Champagne glasses wobbled precariously. A strong hand shot out, steadying her arm and the tray at the same time. "Careful," a deep, smooth voice said. Harper looked up, and froze. The man holding her was tall, with sharp cheekbones, dark hair slicked back perfectly, and piercing gray eyes that seemed to see straight through her. Dominic Gray. The man himself. Her breath caught in her throat. I'm sorry," she stammered, trying to pull herself together. His hand was still on her waist, firm but not unkind. "Are you nervous, or is it me?" His voice carried a teasing edge, his lips curling into a faint smirk. Harper blinked. Was he joking with her? She straightened her back, trying to ignore the way her heart was racing. "It's the tray. These glasses are ridiculously fragile." He murmured, letting his hand linger a second longer than necessary before releasing her. "You're quick on your feet." "Impressive." "I try," Harper said, meeting his gaze with what she hoped was steady confidence. Inside, though, she was unraveling. His presence was magnetic, and the way he looked at her made her feel exposed, like he saw more than just a waitress. Before she could excuse herself and retreat to safety, he tilted his head. "What's your name?" "Harper," she said hesitantly. "Harper Reed." "Harper Reed." He said her name like he was trying it out, savoring the sound. "Interesting. I should get back to work," Harper said quickly, feeling her cheeks heat up. But Dominic didn't move. Instead, he stepped closer, his voice dropping to a lower, more intimate tone. "Or, you could stay for a moment. I'd hate to think I scared you off." "You don't scare me," she said, surprising herself with the boldness in her voice. "Good," he said, his smirk widening just enough to make her stomach flip. "Then stay." Against her better judgment, Harper stayed. He guided her to a quieter corner of the room, away from prying eyes, with a simple gesture. They talked, at first about the gala, then about nothing in particular. Their banter was easy, surprisingly so. Harper found herself challenging his sharp remarks with her own, and each time he laughed, it felt like a small victory. But beneath their words, something else simmered. His eyes never left hers, and every time his fingers brushed hers, sparks shot up her arm. Harper couldn't ignore the tension building between them, an unspoken pull drawing them closer. At some point, Dominic leaned down, his voice softer now. "Come with me." She hesitated, unsure where this was leading. "I really should get back." Just for a moment, he insisted, his tone leaving little room for argument. "I want to show you something." Harper followed him out onto a secluded terrace, the cool night air brushing against her flushed skin. The city skyline stretched out before them, glittering like a sea of stars. Dominic leaned against the railing, his eyes on her instead of the view. "You don't belong here," he said after a moment. Her chest tightened. "Excuse me?" "I don't mean that in a bad way," he clarified. "You're different from the rest of them. You're real." Harper didn't know what to say. She opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat as Dominic stepped closer, so close she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. His hand reached up, brushing a strand of hair from her face, his fingers lingering against her cheek. "Tell me to stop," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Harper couldn't. She didn't want to. Instead, she leaned into him, and the next moment, his lips were on hers. The kiss started slow, almost hesitant, but it quickly deepened. Dominic's hand slid to the back of her neck, holding her in place as his lips moved against hers with a growing urgency. Harper's tray clattered to the ground, forgotten, as she reached up, her fingers tangling in his hair. The world around them disappeared. All Harper could feel was him, his strength, his intensity, the way he seemed to pour everything into that kiss. Her body pressed against his, and his arms tightened around her, pulling her impossibly closer. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing heavily. Dominic rested his forehead against hers, his gray eyes dark and unreadable. "Come with me," he said again, his voice rougher now. This time, Harper didn't hesitate. He led her to a private room inside the venue, locking the door behind them. The air between them crackled with tension, the kind that made it impossible to think of anything else. Dominic stepped toward her, his hands finding her waist as he kissed her again, this time with a hunger that left her dizzy. Harper's hands slid up his chest, fumbling with his tie, pulling it loose as he backed her against the wall. His lips trailed from her mouth to her jawline, then down her neck, each kiss sending shivers through her body. She gasped when his teeth grazed her skin, her fingers clutching at his shirt. "Tell me to stop," he whispered again, his breath hot against her ear. "Don't stop," she whispered back, her voice trembling but certain. Clothes fell away piece by piece, their movements a mix of urgency and care. Dominic's hands explored every inch of her, his touch igniting something in her she hadn't known was there. He kissed her like he was claiming her, and Harper responded in kind, her body arching into his as if they were made to fit together. The rest of the world ceased to exist. There was only this moment, this connection, raw and intense and overwhelming. Harper lost herself in him, in the way he made her feel like she was the only thing that mattered. Afterward, they lay tangled together, their bodies still pressed close. Harper rested her head on Dominic's chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. His fingers traced lazy patterns on her back, his touch soothing. "What do you want, Harper Reed?" he asked quietly. She hesitated, then admitted, "I want to open my own bakery." Dominic hummed thoughtfully, but he didn't press further. For a while, they just lay there in silence, and Harper let herself believe, if only for a moment, that this was real. She fell asleep in his arms, feeling safe and cherished. When she woke the next morning, he was gone. A single note lay on the nightstand, the words written in neat, precise handwriting, "Thank you for an unforgettable night." Chapter 2. 5 years later. Harper Reed hummed softly to herself as she stood in the tiny kitchen of her apartment, flipping pancakes on the stove. The smell of vanilla filled the air, mixing with the faint sound of cartoons playing in the living room. Her 5-year-old son, Theo, sat cross-legged on the worn couch, giggling at the antics of a brightly colored cartoon character. She peeked out at him and smiled. Theo was the light of her life. His messy black curls, wide gray eyes, and mischievous grin were a constant reminder of the night she could never forget. She pushed the thought away. It wasn't time to think about that. She had a day full of work ahead of her. "Breakfast is ready, little man," she called, setting the pancakes on a chipped blue plate. Theo came running into the kitchen, dragging his favorite stuffed dinosaur. He climbed onto a chair at the small table, grinning. "Pancakes!" Harper laughed, ruffling his curls as she set the plate in front of him. "Yep. Pancakes for the future dinosaur explorer." Theo's eyes lit up. "And I'm gonna be the best explorer ever." I'll find all the dinosaurs, and we'll live in a big house with a giant yard. She smiled, sitting down across from him with her own plate. That sounds amazing. Maybe one day, you'll help me open a bakery next door to your dinosaur house. Theo tilted his head. A bakery with lots of cupcakes? Exactly, Harper said, leaning in conspiratorially. And you can be my taste tester. Theo nodded seriously, stuffing a bite of pancake into his mouth. Deal. Harper laughed, her heart full despite the weight she carried. Moments like this made everything worth it. She pushed away the exhaustion tugging at her. Juggling 2 jobs was hard, but she had no choice. Theo needed her to keep going, and she would, no matter how tired she was. Later, Harper dropped Theo off at daycare. He ran inside with a cheerful wave, his dinosaur tucked under his arm. Harper lingered by the door for a moment, watching him join the other kids. She hated leaving him even though she knew he was happy there. Taking a deep breath, she headed out to start her day. Her first stop was the diner. It was a small, bustling place with sticky counters and a boss who always seemed to be in a bad mood. Harper tied on her apron and got to work, weaving between tables with practiced ease. Customers barked orders, and her boss snapped at her to move faster, but she kept her head down and did her job. By the end of her shift, her feet ached, and her smile felt glued on. She grabbed her coat and headed to her second job at the bakery. As soon as she stepped inside, the smell of sugar and freshly baked bread wrapped around her like a warm hug. This place was her sanctuary, even if she was just an employee. Harper tied on a new apron and got to work, kneading dough and decorating cakes with careful precision. She loved the feeling of the flour between her fingers, the way the dough rose under her touch. This was what she dreamed of doing, owning her own bakery where she could create whatever she wanted. One day, she promised herself. One day. A kind older woman came in toward the end of her shift, buying a loaf of bread and chatting with Harper about her dreams. It was a small interaction, but it brightened Harper's mood. Still, as the day ended and Harper headed home, the weight of her responsibilities pressed down on her again. Bills, daycare, groceries, it all felt endless. Across town, Dominic Gray sat in a sleek boardroom, the city skyline stretching out behind him through floor-to-ceiling windows. He leaned back in his chair, his sharp gray eyes fixed on the contracts in front of him. His colleagues watched him with admiration, hanging on his every word as he closed another deal with ruthless efficiency. The meeting ended, and Dominic stood, his tailored suit pristine as he shook hands with the board members. He nodded at their compliments, but his mind was elsewhere. Once the room emptied, he retreated to his penthouse, a sprawling space of glass and steel that reflected his success. But tonight, the silence of the place felt heavier than usual. Dominic poured himself a drink and stood by the window, staring out at the city lights. He had everything he'd ever worked for: wealth, power, respect. Yet, the emptiness inside him never seemed to go away. He brushed the thought aside. There was no room in his life for distractions. That night, Harper tucked Theo into bed, reading him a story about brave adventurers and magical lands. Theo yawned and snuggled under his blanket, clutching his dinosaur. "Mommy, will we ever live in a big house like the one in the story?" Harper kissed his forehead, her voice soft. "Maybe one day, sweetheart. For now, we have everything we need right here." Theo smiled sleepily, and Harper stayed by his side until he drifted off. Once he was asleep, she went to the small desk in the corner of their living room. She opened a drawer and pulled out an old photo, one she hadn't looked at in years. It was from the night she met Dominic. She stared at it for a long moment, her heart twisting. That night had changed everything. Part of her still wondered if he ever thought about her, but she quickly pushed the thought away. She couldn't afford to dwell on the past. Dominic Gray didn't know about Theo, and Harper intended to keep it that way. They were better off without him. The next morning, as Harper prepared Theo's lunch, he looked up at her with wide eyes. "Mommy, do I have a daddy?" The question caught her off guard, and she froze for a moment before kneeling down to his level. "Your daddy. He's a very busy man, sweetheart. He doesn't know about you." Theo tilted his head. "Why not?" Harper forced a smile. "It's complicated, baby. But you have me, and I love you more than anything in the world. Okay?" Theo nodded, satisfied, and Harper hugged him tightly, her heart aching. She hated keeping the truth from him, but she didn't know how to explain the man Dominic had been, or the man she imagined he still was. At the same time, Dominic sat in his office, reviewing a list of potential acquisitions for his company. His assistant pointed out a chain of small bakeries struggling to stay afloat. Dominic barely glanced at the names, nodding as his assistant scheduled site visits. Unbeknownst to him, one of those bakeries was Harper's. That evening, Harper's manager told her corporate representatives were coming to inspect the business. The news sent a wave of anxiety through her. If the bakery sold, would she still have a job? What would happen to her dream? As Harper lay awake that night, staring out the window of her tiny apartment, her mind raced with worry. Across town, Dominic sat in his penthouse, his drink in hand, his thoughts focused on the deal ahead. Neither of them knew that their paths were about to cross again, and nothing would ever be the same. Chapter 3. Harper Reed clutched her notepad tightly as she stepped into the gleaming conference room. The space was all sharp edges and glass, its sterile perfection a stark contrast to the cozy bakery she adored. Executives in dark suits sat around a long, polished table, their conversations a blur of business jargon Harper could barely follow. She felt small, out of place, but she straightened her back and forced her chin up. This was for the bakery. She had to try. Her eyes flicked to the head of the table, where a leather chair sat conspicuously empty. That was where the CEO would sit. Harper swallowed hard, trying to calm her nerves. She focused on smoothing her blouse, brushing invisible lint off her skirt, anything to keep her hands from trembling. The faint click of polished shoes on the tiled floor broke through the chatter. The room fell silent. Harper turned toward the sound, her heart pounding as Dominic Gray strode in. He was taller than she remembered, or maybe it was the way he carried himself, shoulders back, jaw set, exuding an air of control that made the room seem smaller. His suit fit him perfectly, the dark fabric molding to his broad shoulders and lean frame. But it wasn't his clothes that made her breath hitch, it was his face. The sharp lines of his jaw, the piercing gray eyes that locked onto hers the instant he saw her. For a moment, Dominic stopped. Harper saw it, the flicker of recognition, the quick flash of surprise in his eyes. Then, as if a switch had flipped, his expression became unreadable. His professional mask slipped into place, cold and distant. Harper's stomach twisted. She couldn't let this rattle her. Not here. Not now. "Good morning," Dominic said, his voice smooth and commanding. He stepped to the head of the table, placing a leather folder in front of him as he scanned the room. "Thank you all for coming. Let's get started." Harper forced herself to focus as Dominic began his presentation. He spoke with confidence, explaining the proposed acquisition with a calm authority that filled the room. His words flowed easily, but Harper struggled to concentrate. She couldn't stop glancing at him, her heart racing every time his eyes swept the room and briefly landed on her. Was he doing it on purpose? Did he recognize her? Her thoughts spiraled, but she shook them off. This wasn't the time to dwell on the past. When the presentation ended, Dominic opened the floor for questions. Harper hesitated, her hands gripping the edge of the table. Finally, she took a deep breath and raised her hand. "Yes," Dominic said, his eyes locking onto hers. "Go ahead." Harper cleared her throat. How will this acquisition impact the employees and vendors who depend on the bakery? Will they be protected? Her voice was steady, but her heart raced as Dominic leaned forward, his gaze sharpening. That's a valid concern, he began, but there was an edge to his tone, a hint of something that wasn't quite irritation but close. As he answered, Harper felt her frustration grow. His response was smooth, but it danced around her question. She pushed back, asking for specifics, and the room seemed to hold its breath as their exchange became more pointed. I assure you, miss. Dominic paused, as if daring her to confirm her identity. Reed, she said, lifting her chin. Harper Reed. Dominic's lips twitched, almost imperceptibly. Miss Reed, our team has accounted for every possible outcome. Your concerns, while understandable, are unfounded. Harper's cheeks burned, but she refused to back down. I'm just asking for clarity. These are people's livelihoods. The room was silent. Dominic's gray eyes bore into hers, and for a moment, it felt like no one else existed. Finally, he nodded, his tone colder now. Noted. After the meeting, Harper gathered her things quickly, hoping to slip out unnoticed. But as she reached the door, a familiar voice stopped her. Miss Reed. She froze, her pulse jumping. Slowly, she turned to see Dominic standing a few feet away, his hands in his pockets. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were locked on hers. A word, he said, his voice firm but softer than before. Harper hesitated, then nodded. Dominic gestured toward a smaller conference room down the hall, and she followed him, her heart pounding in her chest. He closed the door behind them, the soft click echoing in the quiet space. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Harper clutched her notepad, her mind racing. Dominic leaned against the table, his arms crossed as he studied her. You were bold in there, he said finally, his voice low. Harper lifted her chin. I was just asking questions. His lips curved into a faint smile. You haven't changed. Still bold. Still fiery. The words sent a shiver through her, and she hated the way her body responded. She tried to focus, to remember where she was and who he was now. If you brought me here to criticize my questions. I brought you here because I wanted to see you, he interrupted, stepping closer. 5 years, Harper. You disappear, and now you're here. Working at a bakery I'm about to acquire. I didn't disappear. You were the one who, Harper's breath hitched and she paused. His proximity, the intensity in his eyes, it was too much. Anyway, this isn't professional, she whispered, trying to step back. Dominic didn't move, his gaze never wavering. Neither was that night. The words hung between them, heavy and charged. Harper's heart raced as Dominic reached out, his fingers brushing a strand of hair from her face. The touch was gentle, but it sent sparks through her. She wanted to pull away, to push him back, but she couldn't move. Tell me you didn't feel it, he murmured. That night. Tell me it didn't mean anything. Harper swallowed hard. Dominic, I can't. He cut her off, his lips capturing hers in a fiery kiss. Harper froze for a split second before the tension snapped, and she kissed him back. Her notepad fell to the floor as she gripped his jacket, her fingers curling into the fabric. Dominic's hands moved to her waist, pulling her closer as the kiss deepened. The world outside the room disappeared, and all Harper could feel was him, the heat of his body, the strength of his hands, the way he kissed her like he was claiming her all over again. Her back hit the door, and Dominic's hands slid down her arms, holding her like he was afraid she might vanish. Harper's mind screamed at her to stop, but her body betrayed her, leaning into him, wanting more. Reality crashed down on her like a wave. Harper broke the kiss, her breath coming in short gasps as she placed a hand on his chest, keeping him at a distance. "I can't do this," she said, her voice trembling. "Not again." Dominic's hands fell to his sides, and he stepped back, his expression unreadable. But she saw it, the flicker of something raw and vulnerable in his eyes before the mask returned. "Harper." "No," she said quickly, grabbing her things from the floor. "This can't happen. I won't let it." Without waiting for a response, she rushed out of the room, her heart pounding so hard it hurt. By the time she reached the street, she was shaking, a whirlwind of emotions coursing through her. Dominic stayed behind, standing alone in the empty room. His jaw tightened as he stared at the door she'd fled through, his mind racing. He wasn't going to let her go this time. Not again. Chapter 4. Harper sat at the small table in the bakery's office, her notepad in front of her. Her hands fidgeted with the edge of the pages, trying to focus on the papers the manager was explaining. But her mind wandered, the weight of the week pressing heavily on her. She adjusted her bag on the chair next to her, the strap slipping slightly. Inside was her phone, buried with a picture of Theo she always kept as her wallpaper. The door creaked open, and Harper didn't bother looking up, assuming it was another staff member. But when the air shifted and a familiar energy filled the room, she froze. Her eyes darted toward the entrance, and there he was. Dominic Gray, his tall frame dominating the doorway as he entered the room with his usual commanding presence. Her heart dropped. Of all the places, of all the times, why now? Dominic glanced briefly around the room, his gaze sweeping over her before he moved to the manager to exchange a few words. Harper kept her head low, pretending to write something, praying he wouldn't notice her. She moved to grab her notepad when the strap of her bag snagged, sending her phone sliding onto the table. It lit up with a soft chime, and Harper froze in panic. The screen displayed Theo's smiling face, holding a cupcake proudly in his small hands. His gray eyes sparkled, his dark curls slightly messy, and his grin, the one that mirrored Dominic's, seemed to taunt her. Dominic's steps faltered as his eyes landed on the phone. He stopped mid-sentence, staring at the screen. Harper's heart raced as she reached for it, but Dominic was quicker. He snatched the phone, holding it in his hand, his sharp gaze locking on the image. "Who is this?" His voice was low, almost dangerous. "Dominic, give that back," Harper said quickly, standing up. Her voice trembled, but she tried to sound firm. "Answer me," he said, his tone rising slightly. He held up the phone, his fingers tightening around it. "Is this your son?" His words cracked, his jaw clenching as he struggled to stay composed. "Is this my son?" Harper's throat tightened. The room seemed to close in on her as the silence stretched. She couldn't lie, not now, not when the truth was written all over her face. Her silence was confirmation enough. Dominic's expression changed, his eyes darkening as realization set in. "He's mine," he said softly, more to himself than her. Then his voice hardened. "Why didn't you tell me?" Harper stepped forward, reaching for the phone. "Dominic, let me explain." "Explain?" he snapped, stepping back. "You've had my son, our son, for years, and you didn't think I deserved to know? How could you keep this from me?" Harper's chest tightened as she fought back tears. "You left, Dominic. You left without a word. What was I supposed to do? Chase after you, beg you to care about me or a baby you didn't even know about?" His voice rose, shaking the room. "Yes. You should have told me. I had a right to know. He's my son, Harper. My son!" His words cracked, and his fists clenched as he paced the small space, his frustration palpable. "And what would you have done, Dominic?" Harper shot back, her voice trembling but strong. Would you have brought us into your cold, empty world? Into your life of contracts and boardrooms? He deserved better than that. Dominic stopped pacing and turned to her, his eyes blazing with anger and hurt. Better than his father? Harper's lips parted, but no words came out. She could feel the tension between them building, the air charged with the weight of everything unsaid over the past 5 years. You should have trusted me, Dominic said, his voice rough as he stepped closer. His presence was overwhelming, his intensity suffocating. I deserved to know. Before she could respond, Dominic's hand cupped her face, his other arm pulling her closer. His lips crashed against hers in a fiery, desperate kiss. Harper froze for a moment, stunned by the heat and raw emotion behind it. Then, against her better judgment, she kissed him back. Her hands gripped his shirt, her emotions spiraling as his kiss deepened. Dominic held her as if he couldn't bear to let her go, his touch a mix of anger and longing. For a moment, Harper let herself get lost in him, in the feelings she thought she'd buried long ago. But reality hit her like a wave. She pulled back suddenly, her breath coming in short gasps as she placed a trembling hand on his chest. Stop, she whispered, her voice breaking. This isn't about us. Dominic's chest heaved as he stared at her, his hands still lingering by her face. It's always been about us, he said, his voice softer now but no less intense. Harper shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. Theo is your son, Dominic. But I was scared. I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't even know if I should. Her words hung in the air, and Dominic stepped back slightly, his hands falling to his sides. He ran a hand through his hair, his expression a mixture of pain and disbelief. He's my son, he said again, this time quieter, filled with awe and heartbreak. Harper nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. Yes. Dominic's gaze hardened with determination. I'm not going anywhere, Harper. You should have told me, but I'm here now. I'm not letting either of you go. Harper's heart pounded as she watched him, torn between fear and relief at his reaction. Dominic, you can't just walk in And what? Dominic interrupted, his voice rising again. Be his father? Take responsibility for what's mine? Watch over you both like I should have been doing all these years? Harper took a step back, unsure of how to handle his intensity. You don't understand. Our lives aren't as simple as you think. Theo doesn't even know who you are. Dominic's expression softened, but his resolve didn't waver. Then we'll tell him. Together. Harper didn't respond, her throat tight as she looked at Dominic. His determination was both terrifying and comforting. He took a deep breath, stepping closer but keeping his voice calm. I want to meet him, Harper. I want to know my son. Her walls began to crack, the emotion she'd held back for so long threatening to overflow. She nodded hesitantly, unable to speak. Dominic reached out, gently placing a hand on her arm. His voice was steady, his eyes locked on hers. This isn't over. I'll do whatever it takes. Chapter 5. Dominic arrived at Harper's apartment early, standing at the door with a small bag in one hand. Inside was a book about dinosaurs he picked up after learning about Theo's obsession. It was an attempt to bridge the gap, a small way to start building a connection with the boy he had only recently discovered was his son. His heart raced as he raised his hand to knock, unsure of how Harper would react to him showing up unannounced. The door opened, and there she was, her hair pulled back, dressed in casual jeans and a sweater. Harper froze, her eyes flickering to the bag in his hand and then back to his face. You're early, she said softly, though her tone held no anger. I wanted to spend the day with Theo, Dominic said, holding up the bag. I brought him something. Harper hesitated for a moment before stepping aside to let him in. He's in the living room. Dominic walked in, his polished shoes clicking softly against the wooden floor. Theo was sitting on the carpet, surrounded by toy dinosaurs, his little hands moving two of them in a mock battle. His eyes lit up when he saw Dominic. "Are you my daddy?" Theo asked, jumping up. Dominic crouched to his level, a huge smile on his face. "Yes, Theo. I am." "Yay!" Theo jumped excitedly. Dominic smiled, pulling the book from the bag. "I thought you might like this." Theo's eyes grew wide as he took the book. "Dinosaurs. Mommy, look. He got me a dinosaur book." He hugged the book to his chest, beaming up at Dominic. Harper leaned against the doorway, a small smile playing on her lips. She said nothing, simply watching as Theo plopped back down on the carpet and opened the book, dragging Dominic with him. Dominic sat cross-legged on the floor, flipping through the pages with Theo and answering his endless questions. Harper stood silently, observing the scene. There was a tenderness in Dominic's eyes she hadn't expected, a genuine warmth as he listened to Theo's excited chatter. It made her chest tighten in a way she didn't want to acknowledge. Later that morning, Theo suggested going to the park. Harper hesitated but eventually agreed, knowing Theo deserved this time with his father. The three of them walked to the park together, Theo holding tightly to Dominic's hand while Harper trailed behind. At the park, Dominic helped Theo climb the jungle gym, staying close to catch him if he stumbled. Theo's laughter echoed through the air as Dominic pushed him on the swings, his hands steady and protective. Harper sat on a nearby bench, her arms crossed as she watched them. There was something so natural about the way they interacted, as if they'd known each other forever. It made her feel a strange mix of emotions, happiness for Theo, guilt for keeping him from Dominic, and a warmth for Dominic that she hadn't felt in years. Dominic eventually joined her on the bench, sitting close enough that their shoulders brushed. "He's amazing," Dominic said, his voice soft. "You've done an incredible job with him." Harper looked down, her cheeks flushing. "I did what I had to." "You've done more than that," Dominic said, turning to face her. "He's happy. He's smart. That's because of you." She glanced at him, her heart pounding at the sincerity in his tone. "Thank you." Dominic reached out, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. The brief touch sent a shiver down her spine, and when their eyes met, the air between them seemed to crackle. Harper quickly looked away, trying to steady herself. By the time they returned to Harper's apartment, Theo was fast asleep in the back seat of the car. Dominic carried him inside, cradling him carefully as if he were the most precious thing in the world. Harper followed, watching silently as Dominic laid Theo on the couch and draped a blanket over him. They stood together, side by side, gazing down at their sleeping son. The moment felt intimate, like a glimpse of the family they could have been. Dominic turned to Harper, his voice low. "He's incredible, Harper. You've done such an amazing job with him." Harper looked up at him, her chest tight. "I just wanted him to have a good life." "You've given him that," Dominic said, brushing his fingers along her cheek. His touch was gentle, almost reverent, and before Harper could think, he leaned in. His lips met hers in a soft, lingering kiss. Harper froze for a moment before her body responded, leaning into him. The kiss deepened, slow and tender, as if they were rediscovering each other. Dominic's hands rested lightly on her waist, pulling her closer, while Harper's fingers brushed against his chest. When they finally pulled apart, their breaths mingled, and Dominic rested his forehead against hers. "I've missed you," he whispered, his voice raw with emotion. Harper's heart ached at his words, but she pulled back slightly, her gaze dropping to the floor. "Dominic, this isn't. Let me prove to you that it can be," he interrupted, his eyes searching hers. For Theo. For us. Harper said nothing, her emotions too tangled to respond. That evening, Dominic returned under the pretense of discussing Theo's schedule. Harper opened the door, surprised but not entirely unhappy to see him. They sat on the couch, the dim light of the living room casting a soft glow over the space. I want to be involved, Harper, Dominic said, his voice steady. Not just as Theo's father, but as your partner in this. Whatever you need, I'll be here. Harper listened, her heart racing at the sincerity in his tone. She wanted to believe him, but the fear of getting hurt again held her back. As their conversation slowed, the silence between them grew charged. Dominic reached out, brushing his fingers against hers. Harper, he murmured, his voice low and filled with emotion. I know I messed up. But being here, with you and Theo, it feels right. Tell me you feel it too. Before she could respond, Dominic leaned in, capturing her lips in a passionate kiss. This time, there was no hesitation, only raw emotion and longing as their lips collided. Harper gasped against his mouth as his hand slid to her waist, pulling her onto his lap. Her fingers tangled in his hair as the kiss deepened, their bodies pressing closer, the air thick with heat and desire. But just as the moment reached its peak, Harper abruptly pulled away. Dominic, we can't, she said, her voice trembling. Dominic looked at her, his chest rising and falling as he tried to steady himself. Why not, Harper? You can't deny this. What we have, it's still there. Harper shook her head, stepping off his lap and putting distance between them. It's not that simple. Theo comes first. I can't risk complicating things for him or for us. Dominic's expression softened, but there was frustration in his eyes. Harper, I'm not going anywhere. I'll prove to you that I'm here for both of you. No matter how long it takes. Harper didn't respond, her emotions swirling as she watched him leave. As the door closed behind him, she sat on the couch, her fingers brushing her lips, still warm from his kiss. She felt torn, caught between her fear and the hope he had ignited. Chapter 6. Dominic leaned back against the couch in Harper's living room, his glass of wine barely touched. The dim light from the lamp on the side table cast warm shadows across the room, making everything feel quieter, more intimate. Harper sat on the other end of the couch, her legs tucked beneath her, watching him with curiosity. You seem different tonight, she said softly, breaking the silence. Dominic let out a dry chuckle, rubbing the back of his neck. Different how? She shrugged. I don't know. Quieter, maybe. Thoughtful. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stared into the wine glass, swirling the liquid slowly. Finally, he sighed and looked at her. I was just thinking about my father. Harper's eyebrows knit together. She could see the tension in his jaw, the way his shoulders stiffened at the mention of the man. What about him? Dominic hesitated, as if unsure whether to answer. Then he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He wasn't the warmest person, he admitted, his voice low. Everything with him was about success, achievement. There was no room for failure, no room for softness. Harper's heart ached at the vulnerability in his voice. That must have been hard. It was, Dominic said, a bitter edge creeping into his tone. I spent my whole life trying to prove myself to him, trying to be what he wanted. But no matter what I did, it was never enough. He shook his head, his voice breaking slightly. I don't want to be him, Harper. I don't want Theo to look at me and see that coldness. I want to be better, for him, for you. Harper's chest tightened at his words. Without thinking, she reached out and placed her hand over his, her touch gentle and reassuring. You already are better, she said softly. Theo adores you, and it's not just because you're his dad. It's because of who you are. Dominic looked at her, his gray eyes filled with gratitude and something deeper, something she couldn't quite name. Slowly, he turned his hand over, intertwining his fingers with hers. You really think that? I do, Harper said firmly. You've made mistakes, sure. But you're here now, trying, and that means everything. For a moment, they sat in silence, their hands still clasped. Then, as if drawn by an invisible force, Harper leaned forward, wrapping her arms around him in a comforting hug. Dominic stiffened for a brief moment before relaxing, his arms circling her tightly. He buried his face in her shoulder, holding her as if she were the only thing anchoring him. When Harper pulled back slightly, their faces were inches apart. She could feel his breath against her skin, warm and unsteady. Dominic's eyes dropped to her lips, and his breath hitched. Slowly, tentatively, he leaned in, capturing her mouth in a soft, lingering kiss. Harper froze for a heartbeat before her body responded, her lips moving against his. Dominic's hand slid to the back of her neck, deepening the kiss. It was slow at first, an exploration, but as Harper's fingers curled into his shirt, pulling him closer, it grew more intense. Dominic shifted, pulling her onto his lap, his hands resting on her waist. Harper gasped softly as his lips trailed down her jawline and to her neck, leaving a trail of heat in their wake. Her fingers slid into his hair, tugging gently as her body arched into his. Harper, Dominic murmured against her skin, his voice rough with need. Tell me you want this. Instead of answering, Harper cupped his face and kissed him deeply, her lips parting under his as their breaths mingled. Dominic's grip on her tightened, his hands sliding under her sweater to rest on the bare skin of her back. She shivered at the contact, her heart pounding as their movements became more urgent. Dominic stood, lifting her effortlessly into his arms without breaking the kiss. Harper clung to him, her legs wrapping around his waist as he carried her toward the bedroom. Her pulse raced, anticipation and desire coursing through her as Dominic laid her gently on the bed. He hovered over her, his gaze filled with a mixture of passion and reverence. You're incredible, he whispered before leaning down to kiss her again, this time slower, savoring the moment. Harper's hands worked to unbutton his shirt, her fingers brushing against the hard planes of his chest. When the fabric finally fell away, she took a shaky breath, her eyes tracing the defined muscles of his torso. Dominic smirked slightly at her reaction but said nothing, his focus entirely on her. He undressed her slowly, his hands lingering on her skin as if committing every inch of her to memory. Harper arched beneath him, her breaths coming in soft gasps as his lips trailed along her collarbone and down to her stomach. His touch was deliberate, his movements controlled yet filled with raw intensity. Dominic, she whispered, her voice trembling. He looked up at her, his gray eyes dark with desire. I'm here, he said softly, his lips curving into a faint smile before he leaned down again. Their bodies moved together, every touch and kiss igniting a fire that built with every second. Harper clung to him, her fingers digging into his back as their breaths mingled, their connection growing deeper with each passing moment. When they finally collapsed beside each other, their bodies entwined, Harper felt a peace she hadn't known in years. Dominic pulled her close, his hand brushing a strand of hair from her face as he pressed a kiss to her forehead. Good night, he murmured, his voice filled with affection. Harper smiled, her heart full as she rested her head against his chest. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to hope. Chapter 7. Dominic sat in his office, his hands clenched into fists on the polished desk. Across from him stood his father, Richard Gray, with the same cold, domineering expression Dominic had grown up with. The tension in the room was suffocating. You've been hiding something, Dominic, Richard said, his voice sharp. And now I understand why. That boy, Theo, is your son, isn't he? Dominic's jaw tightened, but he didn't deny it. He had nothing to hide, not anymore. Yes, he is, he said firmly, his voice steady. Richard's lip curled in disdain. Do you have any idea what this could do to our family's reputation? An illegitimate child? And with a woman like her? Don't you dare talk about Harper that way, Dominic snapped, standing up. His voice was low and dangerous, a warning Richard chose to ignore. She's not fit to raise a gray. That boy belongs with us, not with some struggling single mother who doesn't understand the life he deserves, Richard said, his tone colder now. I'll handle it. I'll ensure custody is taken from her, legally and swiftly. Dominic slammed his hands on the desk, his gray eyes blazing with fury. You will do no such thing. Theo is my son. He's staying with Harper. This is my family, not yours. Richard's expression hardened. You think you can defy me? You have no idea what I'm capable of. Dominic's voice dropped even lower, each word deliberate. And you have no idea how far I'll go to protect them. Stay out of this. Dominic arrived at Harper's apartment that evening, his shoulders stiff with tension. He knocked twice, and the door opened almost immediately. Harper stood there, her brow furrowed as she took in his rigid posture. What's wrong? She asked, her voice tinged with concern. Dominic hesitated before stepping inside. We need to talk, he said quietly. Harper closed the door behind him, her stomach tightening at the seriousness in his tone. Dominic, what is it? He turned to face her, running a hand through his hair. My father knows about Theo. He's threatening to take custody. The color drained from Harper's face, and her hand flew to her mouth. What? She whispered, her voice trembling. He can't do that. He can't take my son away from me. I won't let him, Dominic said firmly. But you need to understand, Harper, my father doesn't make empty threats. He'll use every resource he has to try and make this happen. Harper stared at him, her hands trembling. This is all your fault, she said suddenly, her voice breaking. If you hadn't walked out 5 years ago, none of this would be happening. Dominic's chest tightened, and his frustration boiled over. And if you'd told me about Theo, I could have protected you. Their voices rose as the argument escalated, years of pain and resentment spilling out. Harper's eyes filled with tears as she pointed a finger at him. You've always been tied to your father's world, Dominic. How can I trust you to protect us when you're still part of it? Dominic stepped closer, his chest heaving. I'm not your enemy, Harper. I'm trying to help you. You don't get to decide what's best for me and Theo. Harper yelled, her voice trembling with emotion. Dominic grabbed her arms gently but firmly, his gray eyes blazing. I'm not deciding, I'm fighting for you. Before Harper could respond, Dominic leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't soft or tender, it was fiery and desperate, filled with all the anger and passion that had been building between them. Harper froze for a moment, her mind reeling, but the intensity of the kiss pulled her in. Her hands gripped his shirt as their bodies pressed together, the line between love and anger blurring. Dominic's hands slid to her waist, pulling her closer as the kiss deepened. The air around them seemed to crackle, charged with the weight of everything they felt but couldn't say. Suddenly, Harper pulled away, her chest heaving as she stepped back. This doesn't solve anything, she whispered, her voice shaky. Dominic's jaw tightened, his emotions swirling as he watched her retreat. No, but it proves something, he said, his voice softer now. You still care, Harper. You still feel this. Harper looked away, tears brimming in her eyes. What I feel doesn't matter. Theo matters. And I won't let your father take him away. That night, Harper lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. The thought of losing Theo consumed her, and she began to consider leaving town. Maybe if she and Theo disappeared, Richard Gray wouldn't be able to find them. But the idea of uprooting Theo's life and leaving Dominic made her chest ache. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Harper hesitated before getting up, her heart pounding as she opened it. Dominic stood there, his expression determined. "You're not running," he said firmly, stepping inside. "You don't have to do this alone." Harper folded her arms across her chest, her voice trembling. "Dominic, your father." "I don't care what he says," Dominic interrupted, his hands gently cupping her face. "Theo is my son, and I will fight for him, for both of you." Harper's defenses crumbled, and tears streamed down her cheeks. Dominic pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as she sobbed against his chest. As Harper's tears subsided, Dominic guided her to the couch, sitting beside her with his arms still wrapped around her. "We're in this together," he said softly, his voice steady. "I'm not letting you go through this alone." Harper looked up at him, her heart aching at the sincerity in his eyes. "I'm scared, Dominic," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Dominic leaned in, brushing his lips against her forehead. "I am too. But we'll get through this. I promise." Their closeness deepened as Dominic kissed her softly, his hands cradling her face. The kiss was tender, a stark contrast to the fiery one they had shared earlier. Harper felt her fear begin to melt away, replaced by a fragile sense of hope. Harper rested her head against Dominic's shoulder, allowing herself to trust him, if only for a moment. Dominic's grip tightened slightly, his voice low but resolute. "I won't let him take you away from me. Either of you." Harper closed her eyes, her fingers curling into Dominic's shirt as she whispered, "Okay." Chapter 8. Harper stepped off the elevator onto the top floor of Dominic's office building. The quiet hum of phones and soft murmurs of conversation barely registered in her mind. She clutched Theo's favorite stuffed dinosaur in her hand, planning to give it to Dominic to take to Theo later. Her heart felt lighter than it had in days, believing they were on the same page about protecting their son. As she approached Dominic's office, she heard voices through the slightly open door. She slowed, her steps faltering as the words became clearer. "You're right, Father," Dominic's voice said, sharp and controlled. "The boy's future needs stability, and if that means difficult decisions, then so be it." Harper froze, her breath catching in her throat. Her grip on the toy tightened as she pressed closer to the door, her stomach twisting painfully. Richard's voice followed, smug and approving. "Good to hear you're finally coming to your senses. The Gray legacy demands sacrifices, Dominic. You know that better than anyone." Harper's heart shattered. The words hit her like a physical blow. She took a shaky step back, her mind racing. She had let Dominic in. She had started to trust him, to believe he would fight for her and Theo. And now this? The conversation continued, but Harper couldn't listen anymore. Her anger and pain boiled over as she pushed the door open. "How could you?" she demanded, her voice trembling. Dominic looked up sharply, his gray eyes widening in surprise. Richard turned, a slow, satisfied smile spreading across his face. "Ah, Miss Reed," Richard said smoothly. "I was just leaving." Harper ignored him, her eyes locked on Dominic. "You're just like him," she said, her voice breaking. "You're planning to take Theo from me." Richard chuckled softly as he brushed past her, his smug expression cutting like a knife. "I'll leave you two to discuss," he said, disappearing down the hall. "Harper, wait," Dominic started, standing from behind his desk. "Don't," she snapped, her eyes blazing with fury and hurt. "I heard everything. Stability, difficult decisions. You're going to let him take Theo away from me?" "That's not what I meant," Dominic said, his tone desperate. You don't understand. Then explain it to me, Harper yelled, stepping closer. Explain how agreeing with your father is supposed to protect us. Explain how I'm supposed to trust you after this. Dominic ran a hand through his hair, frustration etched across his face. You're not listening, Harper. I've been standing up to him, fighting for you and Theo. Do you think it's easy going against him? He's relentless. Then why were you agreeing with him? Harper demanded, tears streaming down her face. Why were you talking about making difficult decisions? What does that even mean, Dominic? Dominic stepped closer, his voice firm but tinged with pain. It means I've been trying to find a way to keep you both safe without him destroying everything. He won't stop, Harper. He'll go after Theo, the bakery, everything. I'm trying to protect you. Harper shook her head, her voice cracking. I've been protecting Theo since the day he was born, alone. I didn't need you then, and I don't need you now if you're just going to side with him. I'm not siding with him. Dominic roared, his frustration boiling over. I'm trying to fix this for you, for Theo, for us. The room fell silent, their heavy breaths filling the space. They stood inches apart, their emotions raw and exposed. You don't get it, Harper whispered, her voice trembling. You can't fix this by playing both sides. You have to choose, Dominic. Me and Theo, or your father's world. You mean everything to me, Dominic said suddenly, his voice rough with desperation. Harper tried to pull away, but Dominic grabbed her arms gently but firmly, his gray eyes blazing with intensity. Before she could respond, his lips crashed against hers in a fiery, desperate kiss. Harper resisted at first, her hands pressing against his chest, but the intensity of the kiss broke through her defenses. She responded with equal passion, her fingers tangling in his hair as their bodies pressed together. The kiss was raw and emotional, a collision of love, anger, and longing. Dominic's hands slid to her waist, pulling her closer as if he couldn't bear to let her go. Harper clung to him, her heart pounding as the line between them blurred. But just as the kiss reached its peak, Harper abruptly pulled away. Tears streamed down her face as she stepped back, her chest heaving. This changes nothing, Dominic, she whispered, her voice trembling. Dominic stared at her, his chest rising and falling as he struggled to find the right words. Harper, please. No, she said, her voice firmer now. I can't do this. I can't keep letting you in only to have you hurt me. She turned and walked out of the office, the stuffed dinosaur still clutched tightly in her hand. Her heart broke with every step, but she refused to look back. Dominic stood alone in the office, his fists clenched at his sides. Harper's words echoed in his mind, each one cutting deeper than the last. He turned to the window, staring out at the city's skyline as his emotions churned. I'll prove it to you, Harper, he said softly, his voice filled with resolve. I'll prove that I'm not him. The chapter ended with Dominic gripping the edge of his desk, his mind racing with plans to win Harper back and protect the family he was determined to keep together. Chapter 9. Dominic sat at the head of the boardroom table, his fingers tapping lightly against the polished wood as the voices of executives droned on around him. Papers were spread out before him, contracts, projections, and plans, but his focus was elsewhere. In his mind, he saw Harper's tear-streaked face, her words ringing in his ears, I can't keep letting you in only to have you hurt me. The ache in his chest deepened, and he gritted his teeth. Across the room, his father, Richard Gray, stood with his arms crossed, exuding his usual aura of dominance. He spoke with authority, addressing the board about the importance of the deal they were finalizing, a deal that would secure the family's financial future and cement their control over their competitors. But to Dominic, it all felt hollow. The weight of his father's manipulation, the legacy he'd been forced to uphold, and the love he felt for Harper and Theo all clashed inside him. Harper had been right. He couldn't keep trying to live in both worlds. He had to choose. As the room quieted, Dominic pushed back his chair and stood. The sound of it scraping against the floor drew every eye to him. He looked around the table, his gaze finally landing on his father. "This deal is over," he said, his voice steady but firm. A murmur rippled through the room as the board members exchanged confused glances. Richard's expression darkened, his sharp eyes narrowing. "Dominic, sit down. This is not the time for theatrics," he said coldly. "No," Dominic replied, his voice louder now. "This is the time to make it clear. I'm done letting you control my life. My family, Harper and Theo, they're my priority now." The room fell silent. Richard's face twisted into a mixture of shock and fury as he stared at his son. "Do you have any idea what you're throwing away?" he hissed. "I know exactly what I'm choosing," Dominic said, stepping closer to his father. "If you come after Harper or Theo, I will destroy everything you hold dear. This is your final warning." Richard opened his mouth to respond, but Dominic didn't wait. He turned and strode out of the boardroom, leaving the stunned executives and his furious father behind. The familiar scent of vanilla and fresh bread greeted Dominic as he pushed open the door to Harper's Bakery. The small bell above the door jingled, and the warm, inviting atmosphere immediately calmed his frayed nerves. His eyes scanned the room, landing on Harper behind the counter. She was wiping her hands on her apron, her hair pulled back in a loose bun. When she looked up and saw him, her eyes widened in surprise. The memory of their last argument flickered across her face, but she quickly masked it, her expression guarded. "Dominic, what are you doing here?" she asked, her voice steady but cautious. Dominic stepped closer, his heart pounding in his chest. "I needed to see you," he said. "I needed to tell you the truth." Harper crossed her arms, her posture stiff. "What truth?" Dominic stopped a few feet away from her, his hands clenching at his sides. He took a deep breath, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I ended it. The deal, the legacy, everything my father has been using to control me. I gave it all up." Harper's brows furrowed as she stared at him, her defenses softening slightly. But her tone remained skeptical. "Why?" "Because none of it matters if I don't have you and Theo in my life," Dominic said, his voice thick with emotion. "I love you, Harper. I've loved you since the night we met, and I will spend the rest of my life proving it to you if you'll let me." Harper's hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the counter. Her voice shook when she finally spoke. "Dominic, you've hurt me so much. How can I believe that this time will be different?" Dominic stepped closer, his eyes locking onto hers. "Because I've changed. Because I know what matters now. And because I can't live without you." Tears welled in Harper's eyes as she listened, her walls slowly crumbling. Dominic reached out, taking her hands in his. His voice softened, pleading. "Please, Harper. Give me another chance. Let me prove to you that I can be the man you deserve." For a moment, Harper said nothing, her emotions swirling. Then, without thinking, Dominic cupped her face and kissed her. The kiss was soft at first, a tender plea for forgiveness. But as Harper responded, it deepened, becoming raw and emotional. Harper's hand slid up his chest, her fingers gripping his shirt as she melted into him. The kiss was filled with all the love and longing they had kept bottled up, and Dominic's arms wrapped around her waist, pulling her closer. "I'm never letting you go again," he murmured against her lips. Harper's tears spilled over as she clung to him, her heart finally surrendering. When they pulled apart, Dominic rested his forehead against hers, his voice a whisper. "Say you'll give me another chance. Say we can be a family." Harper nodded, her voice trembling. "Okay. But don't make me regret it. Dominic kissed her again, his arms tightening around her as he silently vowed to keep his promise. Applause erupted from the bakery staff, breaking the moment. Harper pulled back, her cheeks flushing as she turned to see the employees watching them with grins and knowing smiles. Dominic chuckled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Looks like I've got some convincing to do with everyone, he teased. Harper rolled her eyes, but a small smile tugged at her lips. You've got your work cut out for you. Dominic smiled, the weight he'd been carrying for weeks finally lifting. He leaned down and kissed her forehead, his voice steady and full of conviction. For you and Theo, it's worth it. As the day wound down, Harper sat with Dominic at one of the bakery's small tables. She rested her head against his shoulder, a sense of peace washing over her. We'll take it one step at a time, she said softly. For Theo. Dominic nodded, pressing another kiss to her forehead. For all of us. The chapter ended with the two of them sitting together, their hands entwined, ready to rebuild their future as a family. Chapter 10. Harper stood in her new bakery, the sunlight streaming through the wide glass windows and bouncing off the freshly painted walls. The smell of vanilla and warm sugar filled the air, her favorite scents in the world. She ran her fingers over the smooth countertops and looked at the neatly arranged shelves stocked with ingredients, tools, and jars of colorful sprinkles. It was perfect, exactly what she had dreamed of for years. Dominic walked up behind her, his steps soft but sure. There's one last thing, he said, holding out his hand. Curious, Harper followed him outside. He pointed to a sign above the door, and her breath caught in her throat. The sign read, Theo's Bakes, inspired by Mom. Her eyes filled with tears as she turned to Dominic, who was watching her with a tender smile. You did this? She whispered, her voice thick with emotion. This is your dream, Dominic said softly, stepping closer and taking her hands in his. But it's our family's future. I wanted Theo to know how much of this came from you. Harper couldn't hold back her tears anymore. She threw her arms around him, holding him tightly. Dominic's arms circled her waist, pulling her even closer. Their embrace lingered, full of love and unspoken gratitude. When Harper tilted her head back to look at him, Dominic leaned down and kissed her deeply. The kiss was soft and full of emotion, a silent promise that he would always be by her side. Harper sighed against his lips, her hands resting on his chest as he whispered, I'll always be your biggest fan. A week later, Dominic stood in front of the mirror in their bedroom, fastening the cufflinks on his shirt. Beside him, Theo practiced his surprise face, his little hands holding a small velvet box tightly. Daddy, do you think Mommy will cry? Theo asked, his gray eyes sparkling with excitement. Dominic smiled, crouching down to Theo's level. She might. But they'll be happy tears. Are you ready to help me with this? Theo nodded enthusiastically. I won't mess it up. I know you won't, Dominic said, ruffling his son's curls. The family picnic was set in a meadow just outside the city, the golden sunlight filtering through the trees and casting a dreamy glow over the blanket they'd spread out. Harper sat barefoot on the blanket, laughing as Theo ran in circles, chasing butterflies. Dominic watched her, his heart full as he admired the way the sunlight danced on her hair. She looked relaxed and happy, a sight that made him fall even more in love with her. You've given me everything I didn't know I needed, Dominic said quietly, sitting beside her. Harper turned to him, her cheeks flushing at the intensity in his gaze. Before she could respond, Theo ran over, grabbing her hand. Mommy, Daddy has something to show you. Harper looked between Dominic and Theo, confused but smiling. Dominic stood and reached for her hands, gently pulling her to her feet. Her heart skipped a beat when she saw the seriousness in his expression. Harper, Dominic began, kneeling in front of her. You've made me the happiest man alive. Harper's hand flew to her mouth as tears sprang to her eyes. I didn't know what love really meant until you and Theo came into my life, Dominic continued, his voice steady but full of emotion. You've changed everything for me, taught me what it means to have a family, to care for something bigger than myself. Theo stepped forward, holding out the ring box with a proud grin. Mommy, say yes. Harper laughed through her tears, nodding as she reached for Dominic's hands. Yes, she whispered. Dominic's face lit up with joy as he slipped the ring onto her finger, his hands trembling slightly. He stood and pulled her close, cupping her face as he kissed her. The kiss was tender at first, but it deepened as Harper wrapped her arms around his neck, holding him tightly. Dominic's hands rested on her waist, anchoring her to him as their love radiated between them. Theo cheered loudly, clapping his hands as he danced around them. I'm never letting you go again, Dominic murmured against Harper's lips. Their wedding day was set in an enchanting garden filled with blooming flowers and soft sunlight. Theo stood proudly as Dominic's best man, his miniature suit matching his father's perfectly. Harper appeared at the end of the aisle, her flowing lace gown catching the light as she walked toward Dominic. Her eyes never left his, and Dominic felt his breath catch in his chest. When she reached him, he took her hands, his voice low as he whispered, "You're breathtaking." The ceremony was simple and heartfelt, with vows that reflected their journey and their love. Dominic promised to cherish Harper and Theo every day, to never let his past mistakes define their future. Harper promised to trust him, to build a life with him, and to always keep their love at the center of their family. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, Dominic didn't hesitate. He swept Harper into his arms, kissing her passionately as their guests erupted into cheers. The kiss deepened, and for a moment, it felt as if they were the only two people in the world. Harper's hands cupped Dominic's face, her fingers brushing his jaw as she smiled against his lips. Theo ran up to them, wrapping his small arms around their legs. Now we're all a family, he declared loudly. Harper and Dominic laughed, pulling Theo into their embrace. Dominic knelt, kissing Theo's forehead before pulling him into a tight hug. You've made my life complete, he whispered. The chapter ended with a flash forward to a bustling bakery. Harper and Dominic worked side by side behind the counter, their movements in perfect sync. Theo helped by handing out cookies to customers, his cheerful chatter filling the space. Harper glanced at Dominic, who was already looking at her. They shared a loving smile, their connection stronger than ever. As the day ended, the three of them walked home together, Theo skipping ahead with his arms full of cookies. Harper leaned into Dominic, their hands entwined as they basked in the happiness they had fought so hard to build. It was their happily ever after, filled with love, laughter, and the promise of forever.